King Matea might have his people believe that the throne is at the very center of the Cusped Kingdom, but the courts are what truly allow Morcia to function on a day-to-day basis. The most prestigious of these, the Aquiline Hall, is the true heart of Morian government. This royal hall serves as its people's principal law court, levy clerk, and ceremonial chamber. Its name comes from the ostentatious eagle above its gate, the crest chosen and adopted by Prince Jalen de Leon. As its patron, the prince prefers this very hall for many of his duties, including the induction of Kingdom Hawk Knights, a ceremony so popular that citizens of the Cusped Kingdom are known to skip even the spectacle of public executions to watch Jalen's finest knights don their iconic mithril armor and swear their allegiance to the prince's banner.
Greetings, Realm Lords, COR Bricks here, and today we're going to look at our first structure here in the Circle of Realms, the Cusped Kingdom's Aquiline Hall, which is this structure right here. Now, we already looked at the Cusped Kingdom's starter units, specifically the Kingdom Archers, and we saw how they have their uses, but they're not very good in a fight toe-to-toe with enemy units. And you may have been wondering, well, how do we get more competent fighters onto the battlefield? And to do that, the Kingdom player, like any other player in the Circle of Realms, is going to need to build their first building. And the first building here for the Kingdom is the Aquiline Hall. This building, like most other buildings that the Kingdom player can make, is based very heavily on the Knights Kingdom 2 series of Lego sets. Specifically, the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that this Aquiline Hall is very similar to the main hall from Lego set 8781, the Castle of Morcia. This was one of my favorite Lego sets as a child, and it was one that I had incorporated into COR back when I first made the game in 8th grade, when this game was basically a bunch of construction paper on the floor of my dad's office. Of course, it's been nearly 20 years since then, and I've made some changes to the building, and so let's dive into the speed build to see how this thing is put together.
The first thing you'll notice as I start to build the Aquiline Hall here is that I am actually beginning by constructing 3 very small, very simple modules before I get to the main structure of the hall itself. These modules serve 2 key functions for this structure. One, they add an additional building step for any player that wants to build the Aquiline Hall on the battlefield, taking a structure that would normally take 2 turns to build and now making it a structure that takes 3 turns to build, which is a much more appropriate number of turns for a starting structure that is as important as the Aquiline Hall is for the Cusped Kingdom. And 2, the modules allow us to configure the hall in actually 2 different configurations when we're building it on the battlefield. The first configuration looks like what I'm putting together right now, and this just creates an additional row of spaces on the Aquiline Hall, which allows it to take up 4 by 3 spaces as opposed to 4 by 2 spaces, and it allows it to perfectly line up with the space system that my game board utilizes. We'll see the second configuration later on in this video, but in that configuration we'll basically remove these modules and nest the Aquiline Hall right at the center of a raised base plate, just as it is built in the original Knights Kingdom 2 castle set. Speaking to that original set, there are a few key changes that I made between this new Aquiline Hall and the original main hall of the Castle of Morcia from the Knights Kingdom 2 series. The first major change you can see is that I shifted the doorway over to the right. That is because the space system that I use consists of 6 by 6 pegged spaces, and that means that it's impossible to have a centered doorway unless I were to have a really wide doorway, which I do not want to have on this building. Another change I made involves the 2 pillars that are sitting next to the gate. In the original Lego set, you could rotate these pillars and basically flip them around so that instead of a blue exterior, you could see this kind of evil scorpion exterior if the castle were taken over by the bad guys. I removed that because, quite frankly, I want the inside to look nice and clean and elegant. As much as I like that play feature, it doesn't really serve any purpose in the game that I am creating here. Now you can see that I also added this white interior to take the place of the evil interior that could be swapped out in the original Lego set. Aside from that, the interior is relatively empty and very open and very wide. And I know that might upset some people, but the reality is that since this is a game first and a display piece second, I want to make sure that it's very open and very easy for us to fit our hands inside the building and to put down units on the various spaces that are inside the structure. I also want to make sure that if we're moving around people inside that building, we're not going to run into all these little details and knock little pieces off and do other things that might frustrate my players, especially since we have a lot of fighting that will happen inside these buildings at key moments in the game when someone might be trying to take over the Aquiline Hall, and we want to make sure that that process is as fun and enjoyable as possible. So I don't want to have a bunch of little knickknacks getting in the way of my players enjoying that experience. For that same reason, I have also kept the back of the structure open, just like in the original Lego set. And you'll notice as I do other buildings or as I go through other buildings on this channel that I more or less do that with all of my structures. I like to keep the back open and exposed so that we can easily reach inside and move units around. When it comes to gameplay, this means that the backs of buildings are vulnerable to attack, and the fronts of buildings are these nice fortified positions where we can have these narrow choke points like our main doorway here that goes into the Aquiline Hall. Now, one of the finishing touches I'll be adding to this hall is an eagle that I'll be building over the doorway. This eagle gives the building a lot more character, and it is the reason why we call this structure the Aquiline Hall in the first place. Aquiline is, of course, a fancy word for of or pertaining to an eagle. Almost all of the buildings that are built by the Cusped Kingdom have some sort of animal heraldry associated with them, and that is because all of these buildings produce various heroes and knights that have different animal crests associated with them as well. Now, aside from that, our Aquiline Hall has one last module being added on, and that is its roof. The roof is accessible by a ladder at the back of the structure. 2 infantry units can stand on it. There are 2 spaces up there. And this is a perfect position for kingdom archers or other ranged units to stand on top of the structure and defend it against attackers. They get a height advantage from being that high off the ground, and they are very well protected since there's only 1 point for attackers to get up to attack them. Well, that concludes our speed build. I'll just do one last quick twirl here so we can see the whole structure. And now let's go look at how this building actually works in the Circle of Realms.
So each building in COR has a few key stats, and the Aquiline Hall has all of the main stats that we would expect a normal building to have. Its first stat is its health. The Aquiline Hall has a health of 10 times 3. 10 health for each of the 3 steps that go into creating this building. Step 1, Step 2, and Step 3. The second stat at the Aquiline Hall is its 6 siege armor. This armor will automatically block 6 damage from any attack type that runs up against the building. So from those 2 stats, we can see that it's a reasonably durable building. The third stat here is its cost. The Aquiline Hall costs 400 gold to build on the battlefield. The fourth stat here is its builder requirement. The Aquiline Hall has a builder requirement of 5, which means that we need 5 builders in the build radius to build this structure. And the fifth stat is its Tech Age requirement. Since this is a starter building, it's going to be built during Tech Age 1, the initial Tech Age of the game. Now, if you're enjoying this video and you'd like to see what other buildings and units and heroes and other realms I've come up with, and just generally want to see updates on what the game board looks like and how the game is played, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting that like button down below. Now, let's put this building on the battlefield.
Now, if you go to the unit page for the Aquiline Hall, one of the other things you will see if you scroll to the bottom is the build order for this building. This tells us that the first thing we need to do for step 1 is remove a row of 4 spaces to make room for the foundation of the building. So that's what I'm going to do right now. If we imagine that this is the game board and we're playing an actual game, I have 5 kingdom archers gathered around the build site to build the building, and so I'm removing the spaces to make room for that first step. And now I'm going to pop that first step onto the play map, like so, and that would be the first turn of building the structure. So after 1 turn of building, the battlefield would then look like this. And now units can freely move onto these spaces that are already here. So I could even take my builder and move him directly onto the early stages of our building, like so. And you can even have combat on the building if you're building it in the middle of some action. But then if we look ahead at step 2, we will see that the footprint expands and becomes 4 spaces by 3 spaces. And so on the next turn, we'd have to remove some more spaces from the field. These are the last few spaces that we'll have to take off to make room for the Aquiline Hall. And then once all these spaces are removed, we can now pop it back in our initial step as well as step 2, which is the bulk of this building. As I pop this in, it fits like a glove in that opening that was created from removing those 12 spaces. And once again, I can now freely move builders inside of the not yet finished structure before moving on to step 3, which will require me to put the roof onto the building. And once that step is complete, then our beautiful Aquiline Hall is finished and it is on the battlefield. It can fully function now, it can train units, and its abilities all come into play. Now, another interesting thing about the build order for the Aquiline Hall is that it actually has a separate build order if you want to build it in a different configuration. So if you find one of these raised 4-sided base plates on the map, like this one, which is right where the Cusped Kingdom player starts at, you can choose instead to build the Aquiline Hall on this raised base plate. Just keep in mind that when you do so, instead of step 1 placing those little brackets on the field, step 1 instead involves putting down a staircase to connect up to our Aquiline Hall. If you do this, you certainly have less freedom on the orientation and placement of the Aquiline Hall, but as a trade-off, it's much higher up and much better protected. There's only a very narrow choke point to enter into the Aquiline Hall, which especially early on in the game provides our kingdom player with a great defensive position.
If we go back to the unit page, we will also see that this building has some production and some abilities. Many of these have a number 2 next to them. That number 2 simply means that step 2 of the building needs to be present on the battlefield for these abilities to function and for those units to be produced. So basically what this means is if the top of the building is blown off, it can still more or less do everything we expect from the Aquiline Hall. But if its main structure is destroyed and it's reduced to just this little strip, then it can't do anything until it is repaired and restored back up to at least step 2, which I have right here. Looking at the structure's abilities, we've got 3 abilities here. The first one is always active, and that's Marian architecture. All that really means is that we can build the building like this, or we can build it in that alternative configuration where it's built on the raised base plate. The second ability, Deposit, is essential at the beginning of the game. Deposit means that you can have your units go around and pick up resources and bring them back to the Aquiline Hall. They can drop off the resources here in exchange for gold, which allows you to make more units later on in the game. Eventually, the kingdom player will be able to build their own mine, which gets money for them every turn. But until that happens, they are stuck bringing resources to this building to deposit them. And the last ability, Induction Ceremonies, is admittedly quite niche. Basically, what Induction Ceremonies means is that every time we train one of these Hawk Knights at the Aquiline Hall, we can subtract their cost from any units that we are executing on that turn. This is a very specific ability because the kingdom player has a unique situation where capturing units is more difficult, and when they do capture units, executing them costs 500 gold each. Using this ability, a kingdom player can double dip and essentially make Hawk Knights the same turn they are executing a prisoner, and they can reduce that ability for the cost of each Hawk Knight that they made. So they could take 150 gold off of it, a maximum of 450 gold off of it if they train all 3 Hawk Knights the same turn that they execute somebody. Last but not least, the unit production of this building tells us that this is a place where we can train our 3 Hawk Knights, which we'll talk about in a later video. But these guys right here, you can see they are based on Knights Kingdom's Jaco in the first wave of sets, Sir Jaco. But essentially 3 of them on the field and they are no one special, they are just the Hawk Knights that the Cusped Kingdom can train. For 800 gold, however, the Cusped Kingdom can train Prince Jalen, who is also based on Knights Kingdom 2's Sir Jaco, but he's from the second wave, so he looks a little bit fancier, stands out a little bit more the way I want a hero to stand out in my game.
If you'd like to check out the full unit page for the Aquiline Hall, or anything else I talk about on this channel, you can view it in detail at www.circleofrealms.com. You can go here to see pages for all the factions, units, and rules that I cover in my videos as they are released. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. And if you'd like to see more videos about the Circle of Realms project, like our upcoming videos about Prince Jalen and his Hawk Knights, then don't forget to subscribe for more content. Otherwise, be happy, be healthy, be well, and I'll see you next time in the Circle of Realms.